All right, so in this video, I wanted to go over how you should structure primary days as a powerlifter or powerlifting coach. And for those of you who may not be familiar with the lingo of primary days, this is essentially how we are talking about the heaviest day of training in our training week, the most important day of training. Usually they're going to have a heavy top set, and then you're going to be having the majority of your overall training volume on that competition movement on a primary day. So this is arguably the most important day to understand how to run a program, because it is the foundation of secondary days, tertiary days, etc. But if you don't have a good primary day, you're going to be not maximizing your results from a program. And I'm going to go over mainly the two considerations that I make when I am structuring a training program for clients, and primary days specifically, and how I'm going to structure them and progress them, as well as ending off with just a few examples of my program and how I approach this for my clients. So the first question that you have to ask is, how does this person need to progress their top sets? How do they respond to intensity across a training block? And you're going to find that you're going to have one of two types of responses. You're going to have one, which I would call the exponential intensity progression model. And this is the person that needs to start off with lighter loads and keep things rather light throughout the majority of the training block as they are building strength. And then they're going to have a big jump into that last week of training. So that is going to be one person that might just be more sensitive to that peak intensity. And as a coach, it is your goal in that sort of response of the client to find where is that breaking point or that threshold where they seem to sputter out if they go above that. For example, somebody like myself, who I tend to fit into more of this exponential intensity progression model, if I touch above an RPE 7 on squat or deadlift, I tend to find I start running out of steam. My week-to-week adaptation isn't as good, and I just generally feel more fatigue that bleeds into my other training days during the week that negatively affects that. Now you're going to have the second type of person who actually does respond really, really well to more of a linear loading pattern. This is what I would call the linear intensity progression model, where they can just go heavier, 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 and they actually need that in order to feel strongest. If this person was to try to do more of that exponential intensity progression model, they would find themselves just feeling really weak and maybe even getting weaker, and then all of a sudden they touch a heavier weights on maybe a week 4 or the last week of the training block, and they'll start actually reporting, I feel strongest on that week 1, and you look at what happened the week before, it's oh, well, you probably need more of a linear loading model in order to feel strongest. This is something that you're going to need to experiment with over time, with understanding what person might fall into each category. But in general, bigger, stronger lifters tend to be more intensity sensitive. So at higher weight classes, lifting more absolute loads will generally respond a little bit better to an exponential intensity progression model. And then lighter, less strong athletes, as far as absolute load, generally are going to respond better to more of a linear loading model as far as intensity goes. Now, the second question that you ask is, what is that average intensity that the client needs to be at on their back down sets in order to really accomplish two things? So before I go into that, this is important to really understand, because lots of times people get the misconception that that top set is the most important set, and it is basically just it's the most important set for measuring what we're trying to increase, right? Which is 1 rep max peak strength, but the majority of the stimulus comes from down sets on our primary day. And so we're really trying to create the best loading zone where the client can really do two things. It should be heavy enough where they can train their technique optimally, but not so heavy that they are finding that their technique breaks down. So you want to have really, really good practice of proper motor learning, because if you're having someone who is going so heavy where they're having to use their back too much on a squat or whatever, that's going to cause lots of extra fatigue. It's also going to be reinforcing, not great movement patterns for that athlete, especially if they are trying to improve their technique. And then it's also we want the athlete to not feel so excessively fatigued so that they can accumulate enough volume to drive top set progress and also just not feel excessively fatigued. So in general with this, bigger, stronger athletes, like I said, are going to respond better to lighter average intensities. And what I mean by this is like they have a wider band of like what can work for them. So like it's not uncommon for me, even like on deadlifts, say somebody's deadlifting 700 pounds, to go down to like 60% of their max for like sets of 5 to start off a block, or even on squats if they're not well leveraged for it, just because it helps manage their fatigue. It's a really good way for them to make sure that they are still progressing their technique well and hitting depth and not feeling like their back is getting super messed up. That's, you know, and then also you're going to find that the peak absolute like intensity as far as percentage of max tends to be just a little bit lower, because they get, you know, when you're deadlifting 700 pounds, you know, even 80% is pretty heavy. You know, that's still 560 pounds. That's just going to drive more fatigue than someone who deadlifts 300 pounds and their 80% of their max is only 240. It's the absolute low just drive more fatigue. And so you guys have probably guessed based off of what I said there, but if you are a lighter athlete, less absolute load on the bar, generally you can respond better to higher absolute intensities on your down sets, and you might actually need that to drive enough stimulus for the athlete to make progress. So, you know, usually they have a a higher starting spot for like the bottom end of their percentages, so it's like 70% as opposed to like 60%, and they can maybe go a little bit higher than like the average, you know, say like the heavier, more strong athletes. So say the peak that I would usually program in as far as intensity wise goes for a bigger, stronger athlete who's more sensitive to stuff because they're bigger and stronger, like 80%, whereas say like a lighter weight class lifter, like I might still program in like doubles at like up to 85% of their max. So hopefully that makes sense. I'm going to show some examples of this in some few spreadsheets in the next section, so stay tuned for that. All right, so in this section, I'm just going to show a couple examples of programming and how this sort of applies. So for me, I'm that athlete that I respond better to an exponential intensity progression model. And then I also generally need lighter average downsets on my lower body, and you know, actually just in general to just feel healthy. Prior to like this change that Joe made, I was doing something very similar to what I was doing with my old coach, which worked for me for a while, but eventually I just started feeling really beat up. And I realized I don't need as much intensity to make progress. So if you look at where we kind of started, it was a lot of like RPE based downsets, and you know, at RPE 5, RPE 6, RPE 6.5, 7. This would be a very typical progression scheme, and this is something that I would program in more for somebody who is that type B athlete who does respond a little better to heavier loading across a block, and they need higher average intensity in order to feel strongest. But for someone who's bigger and stronger, you know, like myself, or not really well leveraged for squats, as those of you who follow me know, it just got to be a lot. My back was starting to feel really beat up, and I just always felt this extremely high systemic fatigue. So what my coach Joe started to do for me was we started doing really light percent work after, you know, a couple RPE based sort of top sets. And that's been really helpful for me, being able to manage my fatigue and still getting in really high quality volume, because like I can go down, hit depth on all these reps, and I feel strong, and I don't feel like my back's getting, you know, hurt or getting, you know, irritated. I feel actually probably the best I have in a while since I started powerlifting, which is crazy to say, but yeah, it just goes to show you can go lighter than you think, especially if you are stronger, and still get a good stimulus out of that. And as far as the intensity progression, you can kind of see RPE 4, RPE 5, RPE 6, RPE 7. This is my threshold, and then we make a bigger jump to RPE 9. And that's sort of how you would program at this end. You can also see the down sets. They go up about, you know, roughly about 3% per week. A little bit of a smaller jump on this last week. Sometimes like I do take this, and other times I just do like the week one, depending on how beat up I feel from those two heavier top sets. So that is an example of more of that type 1, again, exponential intensity increase model, and then lighter absolute loading on down sets to help the athlete feel healthy. this is a good example of my client Hunter, who does respond a little bit better to more of the linear loading model and a little bit heavier on average down sets on some of his days. So you'll kind of see that one exception for him is that, like when I say like heavier down sets, like they're still controlling that progression where we're only adding like 5 pounds from last week. It was basically like capping at like 2% from the week one because I still don't want things usually going above RP7 on down sets in my progression model, but you can see here that his RPEs go up pretty linearly on his top sets into that final week of training, and it's a little bit smaller jumps, like half an RPE increase on his bench press. And you can also see right here on his deadlift, and so we combine his primary deadlift days and squat days. You can see that things are pretty. They stay a little bit heavier. He touches a little bit heavier absolute loading going into that last week, where he actually feels pretty good and usually feels a lot stronger by that point. But I think a good example, just I said about like where they have your average intensity on downsets, it would usually be like an RPE based thing where you're trying to have the RPE at RPE 5, RPE 6, RPE 6.57. Like if you're doing an actual RPE scale of like what 61% is, if you were to take a look at like an RPE chart, you can see that like that's not even like on the screen, like it's like RPE 0, so it's just super easy light work. You kind of just need to see what the athlete needs and how they respond best to, but hopefully that all makes sense. If you guys have any questions, just let me know in the comments. If you guys are interested in coaching, want to optimize your strength progress, I do this for all my clients, super high touch, and customized programs that evolve with you over time as you get stronger, so you can keep getting stronger now and forever. So if you have any questions about that, ask down in the comments below. Application to coaching is also in the link, and I'll talk to you guys in the next one. Peace.